Okay, I think we'll get started. Salam alaikum and peace be with you all. Delighted to see you all here at this fourth annual Luce-Hartford Conference, Christian Muslim Relations. We're delighted you're here. This has become a really important platform the last couple of years. And normally we hold this conference face-to-face, but due to events, of course, we're using a different platform. And because of that, we are now able to reach people around the world. So we have people from all over the world joining us for the next couple of nights. So that's very exciting. I'd like to turn the platform over to President Joel Lohr, who will welcome you all.
Good evening. Thank you, David. It's good to see you all, or at least know that you are there. It's a different format than usual, and of course the in-person is never quite the same, or the Zoom is never quite the same as in person, but I am thankful we have the opportunity to proceed in this way. As David mentioned, my name is Joel Lohr. It is my honor to serve as the president of Hartford Seminary. On behalf of the faculty, the staff, trustees, alumni, and especially our dynamic students, I know many of you are here, good evening and welcome to this fourth annual Luce-Hartford Conference on Christian Muslim Relations. Each year, this conference gathers Muslim and Christian scholars and religious practitioners to discuss an important and timely theme related to peace, justice, and equality in our world. In the past, themes have focused on immigration and refugee matters, the environment, and racial issues. This year, we commemorate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and the women's suffrage movement with the theme, the agency and vital voices of women, Muslim and Christian religiosity and scholarship. We hope you enjoy, learn, but perhaps most importantly, that you're challenged by our speakers this week. This year, our conference will address three main themes: the role of women's scholarly voices in scripture and theology, the leadership role of women in Muslim and Christian communities, and the impact or potential impact of female theological and scriptural perspectives in Christian-Muslim relationships. For those who may not be aware, I'd like to say a little bit about Hartford Seminary. Hartford Seminary was founded in 1834. Hartford Seminary is a non-denominational graduate school for religious and theological studies, and it's known especially for its interfaith work, something I'm passionate about. We are a proud seminary in some ways, probably because of our firsts. The first seminary in America to open its doors to women, the first seminary to have a full-time Muslim faculty member, and the first seminary to have an accredited Islamic chaplaincy program. There are actually quite a few other firsts, but those are three really important ones I wanted to start with. What makes us unique, I think, is our multi-faith environment and our proven ability to prepare leaders for the complex world that surrounds us. It's a really dynamic place to be, to work, and to learn from those who we serve. Just as a little sort of note here, although we have our roots in Christianity, last year our student population had 39% of our students are Muslim. It makes for a great learning environment. And if you don't know much about us, I encourage you to go to our website to learn more. Come learn with us, join us. I've been asked to share just a few little quick things as reminders for you as participants in this webinar. As participants, as you log in, you'll notice that you are muted and not actually visible to the screen. You are, however, able to ask questions in our Q&A box. You'll see the little box down below. We have several people monitoring the Q&As who will moderate the comments and questions that you can ask of our speakers. For speakers, please remember that you've muted yourself, so you will need to unmute yourself before speaking. At the end of the evening, there will be a survey, which I know you probably will say I'm done now, but there will be a survey, and it would really help us if you could take it and fill it out. This is an opportunity for us to learn from you and to learn more about how we can make this conference even better each year. So our moderator this year is an incredible faculty member we have here at the seminary, the Reverend Dr. Chanel Smith, Associate Professor of New Testament and Christian Origins, as well as the director of our cooperative MDiv program, Master of Divinity program. I will now pass over to Dr. Smith so she can introduce our speakers. Thank you, Chanel.
Thank you, President Lohr. Good evening. I'm so excited right now. I have the distinct honor and pleasure to introduce my esteemed colleagues, my sister scholars, and my friends. I will mention only a few highlights from their biographies, but I do invite you to look at their full biographies on the Hartford Seminary website. The Reverend Dr. Katherine A. Schoener is Associate Professor of New Testament at Wake Forest University Divinity School. In classrooms, in faith communities, in the public square, Professor Schoener challenges leaders to listen for the voices of the people who are usually left out of our stories and our scriptural texts and in our histories of justice. She teaches courses across the Christian Testament that explore the theological, social, and political implications of biblical interpretation for contemporary communities. Throughout her teaching and scholarship, she examines the ethics of contemporary Christian biblical interpretation across intersections of race, class, and gender. Her book, Enslaved Leadership in Early Christianity, published by Oxford University Press, challenges readers to rethink common perceptions about how enslaved persons participated in early Christian communities. She is an ordained pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. In fact, today she is celebrating her 13th ordination anniversary. So congrats for that. God bless you with that. As a scholar, she is brilliant, but all of that does not compare to her love and concern as a true friend. Always there, always authentic, a true friend whom I am so grateful to call my own. Oh, yes. So I present to you for our first keynote speaker for this evening, the Reverend Dr. Katherine A. Schoener, who will be speaking on the topic, Women, Agency, and Diversity in the Early Church and Beyond. A simple reminder to you all that you can post your questions as they come to you as Dr. Schoener speaks. Dr. Schoener, you now have the floor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. I mean, I can't even say how thankful I am and grateful I am for your friendship, but also for that marvelous introduction. Thank you so much. And thank you also to President Lohr and to Dean Grafton for the invitation to be here with you this evening. I also want to thank Remy Marcos, who had done some travel arrangements, alas in vain, to Susan Schronberger, Stephen Havira, and all those whose names I'll never know at Hartford Seminary, including the technical workers and the staff who risk their life every day for us to have clean and healthy spaces. Thank you. Another thank you as well to my fellow keynote speaker this evening, whose introduction you will hear after my talk, to Professor Najeeba Saeed. And her work and energy really encourages and inspires, and her labor in the streets and mosques and classrooms, and these days through her laptop on the mountain, it fundamentally changes the world. And so, Professor Saeed, I am honored to share this virtual platform with you. As Dr. Smith said, it is the 13th anniversary of my ordination as a pastor in the ELCA. It's also the year when we're celebrating 50 years of women's ordination, and 40 years of ordination of women of color in the ELCA. It's fitting that I'm speaking about women's agency in a conference about Muslim and women and Christian women's leadership, because I was ordained by Bishop Margaret Payne, who was one of the first bishops in the ELCA, and by Bishop Moody Bunan, the Bishop of the Lutheran Church in Jordan, Palestine, and internationally recognized as a peacemaker and advocate for justice for women. So this anniversary, to be here on this anniversary, is such a big deal for me. These last few weeks have been painful. That is most likely the biggest understatement that I will make this evening. Despair, grief, rage, terror, horror, and weariness tangle with state-sponsored brutality and politically entrenched systems of white supremacy, of deliberate poverty, of intentional neglect, of power-stoked xenophobia and military-style violence. And in this moment of beginnings of this conference, beginnings of this keynote, it's important to name those whose lives were lost. Breonna Taylor, Tatiana Jefferson, Natasha McKenna, Tanisha Anderson, Michelle Cousseau, and Sandra Bland. Hashtag say her name. And those whose lives will never be the same. Wanda Cooper, Valerie Castile, Gwen Carr, Leslie McSpadden. These are the still living mothers of Ahmaud Arbery, Philandro Castile, Eric Gardner, and Michael Brown. And I want to also remember those whose intellectual, emotional, and organizational labor made the current national conversation around Black Lives Matter possible. Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi. So far in the news coverage of the protests that we've seen, and even I suspect in activist discussions, the first set of names that I mentioned have only briefly been discussed. Breonna Taylor's, Tatiana Jefferson's deaths are sometimes, but not predominantly, cited as the reasons for resistance, exemplars of the issue, martyrs of the cause. And if I were to hazard a guess, I would say that many of us, especially those of us who are a little melanin deficient, may not know the second set of names. These mothers whose children are dead in very public and brutal ways. Of course, all of these lists are much, much longer than my short sampling. And all of these lists are much, much more poignant when the flesh and bone and blood and heart and spirit and soul, when the story of each person on them comes to light. And when we consider each person's story on these lists, each person's sense of self, and each person's role as beloved in their families and communities at large. It's because lists and statistics don't tell individual stories. And on the other hand, a singular person or story cannot tell the story of a movement against the structural entrenchment of white, and I would add Christian, often Protestant supremacies. This does not mean, however, that historically, politically, socially, and even theologically, this does not mean that liberation movements, condemnation of systemic exploitation, and communities that operate apart from dominant paradigms do not, did not, or have not existed across our histories. We would not have a conception of the need for liberation, condemnation, or alternate paradigms of community if only the histories that are provable with empire-sanctioned evidence existed. We would not have a conception of the need for agency, that is, the subjectivity, the ability to do things, if socio-political and theological power structures did not actively work toward the objectification and marginalization of large swaths of society. What we do not have are modes of telling histories of strategic, grassroots, multi-person, multi-community movements across time. How will the history of Black Lives Matter, an activist network started by queer Black women intentionally without a charismatic leader, how will that history be told? How will the history of Mothers of the Movement be told? A group of women organizing communities out of their grief for their children. Since my title this evening is Women, Agency, and Diversity in Early Christianity, I want to turn with this historiographic question of how we tell history in mind. I want to turn to a biblical text that I've seen used on social media last week and this week too. I want to turn to the story of Jesus's disturbance in the temple. Now, as a side note, this story is more often called the, quote, cleansing of the temple. And this formulation is at best a description of the story, and at best it's a false description of the story, and at worst it's brazenly anti-Jewish. So I want to steer clear of the cleansing of the temple idea. It's rather a disturbance in the temple. And some of you may know the story. I'm going to put it up on the screen for us to see. It's Mark 11, 15 through 17. It looks like my sharing is paused. There. Good. Mark 11, 15 through 17 reads, "Then they, Jesus and the disciples, came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, 'Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations?' but you have made it a den of robbers. Over the last few years, as wave after wave of protests declaring Black Lives Matter have swept across the world, I have often seen this passage cited among Christians as a justification for Black anger and righteous disruption. Even Jesus got angry when it was justified. Jesus knew sometimes you need to get angry and throw stuff around. And while on the level of solidarity of emotion, I understand why the power of Jesus needs to be invoked by Black and brown Christians in these moments. Something has always bothered me, though, just a little bit about the implied interpretation of this text, especially in white, liberal, mainline, social justice-focused Protestant circles, the circles I know best. In these circles I'll talk about as we, so whenever I talk about we through the rest of the presentation, I'm talking about those circles of which I'm a part. What has bothered me about how this text is used in these settings are two things. One, the fact that we, again, white, liberal, mainline, social justice-focused Protestants, we do not recognize anger, particularly spontaneous anger, as a privilege of whiteness, which in fact it is. The fact that we seem to need a reason outside of 400 years of American history to justify Black anger, Black anger is more than justified. End of reason. We don't even need Jesus for that one. But even more, what really bothers me about how this text is used is that it assumes Jesus acted alone. That this story is about one guy, albeit the Son of God, who was angry enough to change the world, or at least clean up the temple, with just a brief moment of unplanned, unchanneled, unbridled, spontaneous, and uncharacteristic anger. This is not what is happening in the Black Lives Matter protests. This is not what is happening with the protests in the past 5 to 10 years. Black Lives Matter was never waiting for a more powerful, charismatic, singular, angry savior figure. The strategic political work of Black Lives Matter began with Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, 4 Black queer women, and moved into a network of local grassroots organizations, none of which claim singular leadership. What bothers me about the way we use this story is that we place white supremacist limits on our historical and theological imagination around what was or is possible in the story. We do not allow the community around Jesus to be collectively and sustainedly angry. We do not allow the community around Jesus to have worked tirelessly to plan, strategize, organize, and stage the protest. We do not allow the power of women, enslaved people, and disenfranchised laborers to be stronger than Jesus, or even to be necessary for Jesus' strength. You see, there's a fundamental paradox in our theo-historical understanding of Jesus. On the one hand, Jesus is an agential actor, one whose intentions could straightforwardly be put into action and who had the power to be a dangerous, temple and empire dismantling dissident through those actions. Jesus acts, his actions work, at least in our historical and theological imaginations. And only the malevolent are harmed. On the other side of the paradox, Jesus is marginalized. A Jewish man from Galilee in Roman-occupied Jerusalem, where Pontius Pilate has recently tried to install the Roman battle flags near the temple. Jesus is a forgotten member of the unrepresented masses in his immediate political context. Jesus lacks social privilege. Thus, with this paradox, Jesus is both marginalized and central, both vulnerable and powerful, both in solidarity with the masses and kingly in relationship to them. But the paradox breaks down when we assure ourselves that Jesus' authority, his divinely powerful presence, and his ability to enact change only hurts those who think themselves authorities, divinely power, and in charge of the system. So often we theologically declare that Jesus is most present with exactly these communities of women, people of color, disenfranchised laborers, enslaved people, but we fail in our own socio-political context to then also cede authority, divine power, and the building of just systems to these communities. What would happen if we used a historiographical hermeneutic of possibility? Some people call it theological imagination. Some people call it sanctified imagination. What would happen if we asked what else was historically possible? What is the larger story of Jesus's protest in the temple? And how might those possibilities help us to see a stronger position, a stronger voice for the women and marginalized voices within today's nationwide protests? So here's where the question of women's agency comes front and center in the conversation. You may have noticed when I read the story, or you may just now be noticing as I pointed out, that Mark does not talk about any women in this story. Why in the world, you might ask, would this be a pivotal passage for illustrating the need to recognize and operationalize women's agency? I'm glad you asked. It gives me a chance to be a good academic and answer your question with two more questions. Two simple questions that fundamentally change the interpretive perspective on any biblical text, and this one in particular. First question, who's missing? Second question, what information is left out? Note that these questions for me come out of a fundamental commitment that I have as a scholar, as a pastor, and as a citizen to make space for, see as authoritative, and implement reparative institutional change for the flourishing of those marginalized and disenfranchised by gender, race, class, and/or religion. In other words, these questions alone will not help us to see women's agency, particularly in contexts where not all women are socially, politically, economically, or religiously equal. We need to also assume that in nearly any setting, in nearly any historical event, women were there, full stop. We may not see them. The rhetoric of powerful men and even powerful women might note that they're not supposed to be there. But in nearly every historical situation, women and/or other marginalized people were there. It is a tenet of white supremacy, particularly in the United States, that there are spaces where only men were ever present, where only white people were ever present, where only the wealthy could go. But in our ancient history and in our recent history, if we let this rhetoric have sway, women, especially low status women, are erased from historical worlds. Perhaps more significantly, when this rhetoric of women's exclusion becomes history, we keep low status women who work for their communal flourishing from having a history. And having a history imputes agency. So to my two questions, who's left out? And who is left out of Mark's telling of the temple disturbance? We have already noted that women are not explicitly mentioned. But there are characters in the text and actors in the historical story. So remember that Mark is not the historical story, there's a historical story behind it. There are characters who are unmarked by gender, ethnicity, or slave-free status. They are instead marked by economic status. And I'll note here that this short story does show up differently in the other Gospels other than Mark, but I've chosen Mark just for simplicity this evening. Jesus and his followers enter the temple precinct. It's not a building, it's a whole enormous open air area. And they're entering just as Passover is about to begin. And Passover is a festival for which many people, wealthy and not so wealthy, made pilgrimage to Jerusalem. As Jesus and his followers look around, they encounter buyers, sellers, money changers, pigeon dealers, and probably a whole host of other characters. Our contemporary assumptions about the historical role of women, especially high status women, in first century Jerusalem, and particularly the temple, our assumptions get in the way of reading women and slaves as part of this story. But scratch away just a little bit from the historical patina of contemporary assumptions about women, and we start to see women doing things, important things. Women were doing things that even Jesus couldn't do. So there are a few things that I just need to tell you before I move further into that point. There are a few things I just need to tell you about ancient temples, money changing, banking practices, even animal husbandry. And ordinarily, I'd hand you a bucket of ancient evidence, see forthcoming article in Journal of Biblical Literature. But alas, I only have 30 minutes. So first of all, temples and spaces around them, particularly during pilgrimage seasons, were incredible economic engines for the cities and surrounding countrysides. Jerusalem's temple was no different. Pilgrims needed the right coins for the temple tax. They needed animals and grain to offer as sacrifices. They wanted souvenirs to take home. They needed food, shelter, transportation, and other services, including all those seedy services that your imagination can conjure. All of these involve women and enslaved people. Those who own the money-changing businesses, for example, would not have been sitting at their tables themselves. It was too dangerous. Their slaves were there. Pigeons and doves and other small livestock were purchased by impoverished travelers for sacrifices. They were often raised as side hustles for rural women. Small pottery, textiles, prepared food, services, these were often also produced and sold by women. All are possible reasons women could have been the pigeon dealers and the merchants that day in the temple. So if we allow archaeology and historical evidence to permeate our picture of the temple that day, there were women and there were enslaved people there. The problem is, if Jesus's table flipping is a just and spontaneous angry reaction to the abuses in the temple, women selling pigeons and slaves losing their master's money are the ones who are most hurt by his anger that day. That's not the Jesus who lives in solidarity with the most vulnerable and marginalized in his world. That's a Jesus whose privilege produces violence that makes other people into victims too. It is, to say the least, a troubling picture of Jesus, especially in our contemporary world. In fact, constructions of women in the early first and mid-first century CE are most often built on the lives of women of means, white women in contemporary analogies, generally speaking. Enslaved women, impoverished women, disrespected women rarely figured into our broad strokes generalizations about women's lives in antiquity, or I would add, of course, today. Women whose work is menial, uncompensated, or disreputable are rarely ascribed economic, political, or social agency. Such omissions overlook women whose work has always been outside of domestic spaces. Let's think about African-American women in the 1950s who worked in domestic service, or agricultural workers in most of the US now, or textile workers in first century Galilee, or those whose work is disreputable, who we'd rather just not think about. Yet low status and or disrepute is not grounds for the exclusion of women or disenfranchised workers from the historical picture. And so you see, we kind of painted ourselves into an interpretive corner, at least if we continue to require that Jesus inhabit a paradox of the singularly powerful actor and the one who stands in solidarity with the most marginalized. If the money changers, pigeon dealers, and other merchants were women, enslaved people, and other disenfranchised workers, Jesus's table turning did not hurt the powerful people, or the economic system, or the religious establishment, or the imperial machine. In the immediate term, with the powerful actor marginalized man paradox still in place, Jesus's righteous anger victimizes the most vulnerable for the sake of reform at the hands of a powerful man and the other men in charge. Jesus, the all-powerful, works against the purposes of Jesus, the marginalized solidarity worker. So often the interpretive choices we make reify the all-powerful Jesus and then do contortion work to make the exercise of that power more loving than the exercise that that power would be if Jesus were a mere human. But what if? What if we took seriously the agency, the subjectivity of those whose bodies would have paid for Jesus's protest? What if we took seriously the agency of the women, enslaved people, disenfranchised workers who are part of the story? What if we gave the agency, the power to the community around Jesus? What if these vulnerable workers who were responsible to their masters and their families for the destruction Jesus caused that day, what if their political and intellectual savvy provided the strategic conditions for the protest? What if the women and slaves, what if their strategic work organizing among themselves, talking with impoverished pilgrims from all over the region, what if their work made Jesus's disturbance possible in the first place? In other words, what if Jesus's movement, indeed significant parts of the early Christian movement, were organized by these women and slaves? In answering this question, another picture of Jesus's ministry emerges from our contemporary and ancient explorations of women's agency. a picture that magnifies the muffled and obfuscated voices of women and does so on their own terms and with collective empowerment rather than singular charisma. Instead of oppressed victims in need of a liberating savior, the women, enslaved people, and other vulnerable workers become self-representational subjects whose collective power sustains communal practices of liberation. Modern movements we've already noted, and particularly justice movements, run into this kind of co-optation at the hands of charismatic men and the push for singularly voiced leadership. Alicia Garza, one of the founders, along with Patrisse Cullors and Opal Tometi of Black Lives Matter, points out this dynamic well when she describes her frustrations with the way that her organization's work has been taken over in the years since its inception. Straight men unintentionally, she writes, straight men unintentionally or intentionally have taken the work of queer Black women and erased our contributions. Perhaps if we were the charismatic Black men many are rallying around these days, it would have been a different story, but being queer Black women in this society and apparently within these movements tends to equal invisibility and non-relevancy. End quote. The women and enslaved people whose lives were disrupted and made more difficult after Jesus' actions in the temple might have been part of the Jesus movement, #Women's Jesus Movement. They might, in fact, have been the reason Jesus even had access and resources to stage his actions. Such is possible within the historical circumstances. The gospel writers note that groups of women traveled with Jesus and paid for his upkeep. But marginalized people's contributions to the movement, especially their strategic contributions, are not acknowledged in the retellings of this story that remain. Jesus, the charismatic leader, rallies other leaders from the temple to discuss the matter. This is Mark 11, further in Mark 11, leaving women and other marginalized folks invisible and irrelevant in the usual interpretations of the story. Of course, anytime we suggest Jesus's diminished importance as a central figure to the story, especially in a story that has developed as an anti-imperial, anti-corruption, anti-abuse morality tale, I know your eyebrows are raising, even if I can't see you.
5 minutes.
Thank you, David. Yet the very singularity of Jesus's charismatic and political power in these tellings of the story is precisely the political and theological problem. That singularity creates a paradox and simultaneously disavows women's agency. Liberation is never effective if singularly credited and enforced. Empire is. The singular Jesus then becomes Emperor Jesus, even if we insist that this Jesus is inclusive of the marginalized. Once again, Black Lives Matter and Garza give us some historical analogy and context. Garza writes, "We completely expect those who benefit directly and improperly from white supremacy to try and erase our existence. We fight that every day. But when it happens amongst our rallies, we are baffled, we are saddened, and we are enraged. And it's time to have the political conversation about why that's not okay." What Garza says to us for today is that it's not okay for any of us to claim that heritage of Black Lives Matter unless we're the ones who started it, unless we're the ones doing the work, unless we're the ones following the authority and the power and giving intellectual and emotional credit to those who are doing the work. So if we take seriously the power of decentralized, grassroots, fully differentiated group leadership, the paradox around Jesus goes away. This shift in power perspective insists on truth-telling, that women and marginalized communities are, in fact, responsible for the development, strategizing, organization of liberation ideas and actions within the Jesus movement. What would it mean if women and marginalized communities perpetuate their own liberation along with, rather than at the behest of Jesus? What if Jesus is powerful because of the agency of women and marginalized folks and in solidarity with them? Perhaps the women in the temple the day of Jesus' disturbance knew that a disruption in their work would create an opportunity to rally not only their fellow workers, but also impoverished, travel-weary pilgrims. Disturbing the commerce in this part of the temple would have garnered their attention too, even those who weren't necessarily part of the organizing apparatus. And if you look at Mark 11:18, which didn't fit on my screen, the crowd there is spellbound by Jesus's teaching. The crowd. Jesus has gathered a crowd for a rally. It's not the scribes and the temple priests. It's not the Roman soldiers and the governor. Of course, they get involved later and make sure that Jesus doesn't do this again, right? But once the crowd's attention was focused on the reparative movement of which Jesus was a part, as well as the multiple coexisting resistance movements that are also part of Galilee and Palestine and Jerusalem at this time, more people could gather and hear how and why the protests and disruptions should continue. This rallying cry given by women, enslaved people, and other vulnerable workers together who may not have had other means of gathering, it might create a disruption in the cycles of exploitation and abuse. Even if for a few weeks, a few months, even if to give us history that then can build the agency of women and marginalized folks in today's world. This move is potentially more transformative for geopolitical realities in the 1st century CE and in our own contemporary context than a singular all-powerful man could ever enact. The salvific power of God emerges for me in this story in the community leadership of marginalized agents, of women, of enslaved people, of disenfranchised workers, working strategically in grassroots spaces to make life more transformative for all of us, even those of us who are part of the empire. Thank you.
Perfect timing.
Good.
Dr. Shannon, you want to stop sharing your screen?
I will.
Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you so much for that powerful presentation, the truth telling. Of course, you know, I'm going to call and text you to talk about this more in depth later, and we will get a chance for Q&A. However, we will move on to our second keynote for this evening. Dr. Najeeba Saeed is a rock star. Yes, she is. I had to say it, okay? She is Associate Professor of Interreligious Education at Claremont School of Theology and will be joining the faculty at Chicago Theological Seminary next month. Congratulations. She is recognized as a leader in peace building and was named Southern California Mediation Association's Peacemaker of the Year in 2007. Professor Saeed's track record as a peacemaker has made her a sought-out advisor for state, federal, and White House initiatives and in international conflicts in Guam, Afghanistan, Israel, Palestine, India, and France. I told you, rock star. She serves as an advisor to local and federal agencies on interfaith dialogue, cooperation, and public engagement, and was most recently engaged at advisory convenings sponsored by the Interfaith Youth Corps collaboration with the White House Challenge, the President's Interfaith and Community Service Campus Challenge.
The last White House, not this White House, please. I have stepped foot in there.
And yet, despite all of her accolades and being a highly sought after scholar activist, when I call her, she is there, just like this afternoon. She's there to listen. She is there to give advice, and she is there to make space for me. And I'm so grateful. This is just the type of friend that she is. So while this is a conference for all of you, and I see there's almost 100 already on it for today. It's a conference for you, but it is a beautiful reunion for me. So I am grateful. Again, please feel free to post your questions as you get them when Dr. Saeed is talking to us. So everyone, I give you our second keynote speaker for this evening, Professor Najeeba Saeed, who will speak on the topic, Muslima, Peacemaking, and Social Justice. Thank you.
I'm so delighted to be here, and of course, covering two whole fields of development within half an hour is completely easy and doable, but we'll certainly get into it. So I always, part of peace studies pedagogies is to use elicitive approaches to knowledge. So I actually would like in the chat, I have two questions for you that I'm going to ask and we'll return to. The first question is, what is your metaphor for justice? When you think about the word justice, what is either a visual metaphor or a word or an idea? Just think about what is your metaphor for justice. So that is the first question. The second question is, what does peace look like for you? So those are two questions that we will come back to in this conversation. And I'm going to start off, as I have committed to starting off a lot of my lectures with something creative. So I'm going to start off with a really brief, it's kind of a little poem, I guess. Tell me where is most sacred, the whole earth herself, anywhere and everywhere. Tell me who is most sacred, the ones whose bodies are pierced by tyranny. Tell me why. There is no veil between their prayer and our Lord. So those are summaries, actually all of them, of sayings of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, upon him be peace. So just think about some of those ideas that he has articulated in his sayings, and they were caught sort of in a question and answer modality. And in fact, that's a lot of the way that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught, was he was often answering questions that people would pose to him. So I think he, as a teacher, was really a believer in democratic pedagogy. If we think of Bell Hook's work and others who do so much around pedagogy, this idea of questions and posing questions and answering questions. I often tell my students the better question to my question, the better answer to my question is a better question, which I understand is a rabbinical teaching as well. So I unintentionally ended up speaking as a rabbi, which is interesting in and of itself in interfaith settings. So I want to talk a little bit in this conversation today about metaphors for justice, because the metaphor for justice that we carry, the visualization of peace, I don't know in terms of what please share your metaphor for justice or what peace looks like to you in the comments. You can share them right now in the chat. That would be wonderful. So very often the metaphor for justice, I have a legal background and legal education. The metaphor for justice is a blind woman carrying scales or on a scale, but this idea of a retributive system, a system in which one is harmed and therefore one must take retribution. And when we look at some of the metaphors for justice that come from the Quran, it's really powerful to understand that so many of our metaphors for justice are actually deeply culturally based. They may come from our historical understanding of a religious community, but they also can come from our the passing down of knowledge in our neighborhood, in our community. And so I really want for you to think about what your metaphor for justice is. And that's the metaphor for justice that's so often shared in the legal system, the one that I was educated in here in the United States. And one of the things that struck me as I was thinking about a metaphor for justice, looking at not just the aesthetics of Islamic art, but looking at this notion of symmetry, and then turning to the Quran, to Surah Rahman, which is a beautiful surah phonetically for those of us who have been trained in recitation. It's one of the most beautiful surahs to hear. And many who don't even understand Arabic or are not necessarily believers in the Muslim tradition, I've found the recitation of it, there's something about it that is really powerful just in its form and its sound. In addition to that, the metaphor for justice that we elicit from this surah, and keep in mind, Rahman comes from the word rahama, as we know in the Hebrew language and the Arabic language, that root, three-letter root, rahama, comes from the word for womb. So it's a very powerful imagery from the surah, from its name to its history to the reasons of revelation, which I won't go into today because we don't have as much time. But what struck me is that this surah offers an ecosystemic view of justice, an ecosystemic view, not the weights per se, and not just the dimension of these two weights, but it offers a dimension of depth, that we add a dimension to the notion of justice beyond even 3 dimensions, perhaps 4 or 5. And what is powerful, the Quran tells us here in this surah, and the heaven he raised and imposed the balance, that you not transgress the balance, and establish weight in justice, do not be deficient in this balance. So this idea of balance, that this surah goes on then to name the favors of Allah, the ones that are given to human beings. And what's powerful about them is they include not just the ones that you would think that exist in the world, but this idea of even in the surah tells us that even as Allah speaks in the surah, that even the trees bend towards God through their shadow during the day. We know other parts of the Quran tell us that animals have, in fact, civilizations like human beings do. So what struck me about this ayah of the Quran, coupled with other verses of the Quran from Surah Zilzal, that human beings on the day when we are all gathered for justice, the earth speaks about what humans have done to her. And again, the earth is a feminine, has a feminine, in Arabic is referred to as a feminine object. So this idea that not only is justice a scale, but justice is the balance of creation, that inherently within the balance of creation is justice, that it is not just good versus evil. It's not a binary. In fact, justice is this balance. And that what do human beings do? We, unlike angels who don't have the free will that we do, what we do is transgress that balance. So the earth will speak to our transgressions of that balance. In fact, the earth is animated in this conversation around peace and justice. So I'm not going to spend as much time on this notion of an ecosystemic view of justice, but it is a powerful metaphor for me that helps replace this idea that justice is a scale of receiving compensation for harm against me. And we'll talk about some of the implications of this metaphor of justice. And one of the things that I think is very important to, as we develop this ecosystemic metaphor of justice and operationalize it into practice, is that peace very often, I don't know if some of you have the vision of a dove flying or 2 children holding hands and sitting at a, I feel like my 12 and 14-year-old are always showing me memes, and they're like, Mom, you're just too old, you don't understand them. But these are sort of the memes of my time. Thinking about this idea of also how we look at violence. And Dr. Schoener's talk was really helpful in thinking through. John Galtung says that it's not just violence of an individual, it's this notion and the connection for me between justice and peace is the harm done by structural violence. So structural racism is a concept that exists in the lexicon. And in addition to that, from peace studies, we have this idea of structural violence. And an example I often give my students is that in Los Angeles every year, I think it's a Catholic church that has a mass for the 500 plus unsheltered individuals that die, very often nameless, in the streets of Los Angeles. And that is a form of structural violence. There wasn't a person that went out and committed violence against any individual, but it was the structural racism. It was the incapacity of Los Angeles to deal with, in many ways, the sin of housing that is out of the reach of most human beings. So it's a form of structural violence. So structural racism begets structural violence. And I think it's really important to think through when people say, how can you be a peacemaker and stand in front of the ICE detention center with clergy of other backgrounds, and you are standing there against the detention of migrants, and then also at other times standing in front of private prison companies, that in fact is the work of a peacemaker, because it's not just standing up against what I call the myth of interpersonal peacemaking, where you have two children, I was giving you that example, two children in the playground who are having a fight. That is beautiful to be able to intervene in that conflict. And in fact, I teach and train people around the world to do that work. What we often do though is stop with the analysis of even international conflicts with this idea that what you need to do is just get along with each other. In my work, I call that the myth of interpersonal peacemaking. And what's problematic about this myth of interpersonal peacemaking is that it creates the burden of producing peace in conditions that are inherently violent. So Linda Tuhuwai-Smith, who writes about indigenous, about decolonizing methodologies, has really, in my work, shown me, as she says, that in many ways, the negotiation of peace has been most violent in her work and research for indigenous communities all over the world, and as we know, is in the history of the United States. So I often tell my students, there's been no word that has been utilized more for justifying violence than the word peace. So it's a very complicated conversation to have, and we have to always return to what is not just the metaphor of justice or the metaphor of peace, but what is it being used for? And I also wanted to point out another dichotomy that exists within the world of peacemaking, and that's this notion of an international world of peacemaking and a domestic world of peacemaking. And I remember reading John Paul Lederach's work very early in my career. And one thing he talked to, particularly to those from North America, that if you're going to go around the world and do peacemaking, you better be doing something in your backyard. Because what has happened is, and this is very problematic and particularly has implications for Muslim women, both in the United States and abroad, is that, for instance, the language of genocide is not being applied right now to state violence and police violence in the United States, because somehow the United States is immune from the language that's used for international conflicts. So international peacemaking is one field and United States peacemaking is another field. And in fact, when the United States in foreign policy has been responsible in different countries for violence that disproportionately affects women in most conflicts, as we know, the burden of war has often falls on women's bodies. When I was in college many years ago, a lot of our organizing at that time was on trying to criminalize the use of sexual assaults, particularly at that time in the Bosnian conflict. And this sort of the burden of violence falls on women, and not being able to be critical for those of us that are here in North America, to be critical of foreign policy and to be critical of domestic violence, meaning violence that is done by policies here. You know, words like genocide are not possible in the United States to use for the actions of the US government done in the streets of Chicago. That is not a language. It's used by many activists. And I wanted to point out that this is really one of the great contributions of Malcolm X, was his language around what, if violence, in fact, as he says, if violence is wrong outside the US, it's also wrong in the United States. So to hold accountability for violence and the language that's used should not be exceptionalist for the United States, particularly if the United States is promoting a notion abroad that it's not holding up at home. And I think that's been in the discourse, can go back to Marcus Garvey, it's been in the discourse for many generations. I just wanted to point out that some of the contribution of Muslim activists and scholars in the United States, like Malcolm X, is to join those conversations together, so that those families in Flint that are dealing with water that is killing them over time. And the other thing I wanted to talk about here was slow genocide. Genocide is often seen as happening quickly and it is done. But one of the arguments we can make for the United States project, as Dr. Schoener said earlier, for the white supremacy project, is that there have been times of genocide that are apparent and the numbers are large, and there have been times that there is a slow genocide through environment, and then that's why I wanted to articulate the voice of the earth in this conversation, to articulate her voice. So this notion of balance, again, the imbalance and the violence that it creates includes not just instruments of war, but includes also instruments of how the earth herself is weaponized and polluted. And I think, particularly with women as peacemakers, we see in the work of Atin Anwar in Indonesia, Yasmin Saika looking at South Asia, we see examples in the United States of peacemakers like Amina Matthews with the Interrupters. I think what's profound about all of this scholarship and activism is that it is actually women who cross enemy lines the first in conflicts around the world. And these scholars and activists, usually, as we know with the Black Lives Matter movement, I can speak here to the Los Angeles community where I live, it's the mothers that are organizing. And in fact, I would argue that the Black Lives Matter movement in this moment is perhaps the greatest peacemaking movement of our time. And that it is really women and mothers that are pushing, and I don't mean you don't have to be a mother in that sense, but these are the women at the front lines that are standing up to state violence. And so I just wanted to articulate that as well. It's not giving women agency. They already have the agency. It's naming it with the honor that that those that founded the Black Lives Matter movement should be worthy of a Nobel Prize. And why are women, when we come to formal peacemaking negotiations in almost every conflict of the world, women are not at the table? And the durability of any peace agreement without women is really one we should question. So anyways, that was just my introduction. So I just wanted to give you sort of a language around breaking down the notions of peace and justice that are so often framed and unfortunately are buttressed very often by, for instance, theologies of reconciliation, to push the voice of those that are seeking justice as a means of peace, or seeking justice before peace is imposed on them. And so I think this word peace is deeply problematized. So if we consider this ecosystemic view of justice, one of the things that we also learn from the Muslim tradition is that it has a very rich history of an ummatic concept of human organization. And the reason that this idea of ummah, or this idea of peoplehood based on faith, is important is that Mernisi, in fact, talks about one of the great fears of Islam is that it helps to create a connection beyond borders. And so we live in the time, really in the waning of the nation state, but we live in a time where something that creates connection beyond borders is to be feared. So when Prophet Muhammad says that if one part of the ummah hurts, then the whole, one limb of the ummah hurts, I'm summarizing it as saying, the whole body hurts. This creates a connection, an imaginary beyond nation states and borders. And if there was ever a time that borders are weaponized, thinking about the southern border of the United States of America, what would it mean to create an empathy based on faith that questions and interrogates the nation state? And I think that's a really important concept as we go forward, thinking through what does it mean to have a sense of peoplehood based on common faith that does not establish empire, but actually is an alternative human organization to empire. I think we've lived through the periods of time where, and I would say right now, we live in the United States bordering perhaps on the use of religion again to establish empire. What does it mean though? Is there an alternative language in which our religious identities create such a deep sense of interdependence and empathy that they offer an alternative view of human organization?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, ooh, okay. The other concept I wanted to talk about was ahsan al-taqweem, this idea of the body as the most excellent creation of Allah. It comes from the Quran as well. And this somatic concept of the body is very important because one of the things that we learn around violence and peacemaking is that it's not just the body, it's not just, again, that structural violence. It's not just violence, but it's the threat of violence that imposes on this most beautiful creation that Allah has articulated as excellent and beautiful in and of itself. So Sylvester Johnson's work on surveillance of bodies, particularly surveillance of Black communities, including Black Muslim communities throughout history of this country, that really is, it really gives us a language around thinking through. It's not just violence you see, it's not even just structural violence, it's the system that creates the threat of violence. Surveillance, constant surveillance of the human body is in fact an embodied form of violence. And this is something we need to talk about for individuals and communities. And as we know, many activists who've been involved around the country have been targeted. Migration activists, Black Lives Matter activists have been targeted through surveillance. And I've been talking about that more and more in my work as state violence. And one of the powerful pieces here, if we look at Sajadina's work around dignity and karama, is that every human body is born with dignity. It is not dignity granted by the state. It's not even dignity granted by other people. It's dignity that is inherent in the creation of the human body. It's not dignity granted just to men, just to women, just to Muslims, just to Arabs, just to Kashmiris. I'm Kashmiri, I thought I would include that in there. Whatever the background is, this is a very powerful concept, this notion of dignity granted by God for every human being and every human body. Because if we look, for instance, at Miriam Kaba's work on prison systems, they are designed to create not just physical violence, but what we call dignity violations. And sociologists and other scholars talk about the violation of dignity is actually a violation that impacts the human body over time more than direct violence. Think about in some of the language on gender-based violence. We now know emotional abuse has a generational impact. There may not be a physical mark on the body, but the violation to the human dignity is a profound imposition. And one of the things I've been doing in my work is, I think we spend so much time pathologizing people who experience violence. And I relocate or dislocate the language of pathology, not to the person who is the target of violence, but to those that are imposing the violence. And I would hope that we begin to think about that language as well, that the sin of violence is one in which the dignity cannot be taken away. The dignity is endowed by God in every human being. And it's again the imbalance that's created by the violator of dignity. It is not the person who is receiving or is the target of violence that is not just the problem, but is also the problem lies deeply in the systems that support the violation of the most beautiful form of creation, that of the human body. And this, we continue with this ecosystemic approach, this idea of empathy being embodied. Imam al-Ghazali in his work talks about, to be able to feel empathy for another, you must actually feel some pain. So empathy is not a belief, empathy is not a doctrine, empathy is not a, an affect alone. It is an actual physical response.
5 minutes.
So one of the problems we're facing in this current climate that has to be named, a pathology that has to be named, is what we see as the empathy gap. That very often people from majority backgrounds are unable to see the pain of African American men and women. And this is documented, this empathy gap is documented in surveys on a regular basis. And this is deeply problematic because it comes again with theologies that have supported it for generations. Whether it was in the time of slavery, the notion that bodies don't experience pain in the same way, or whether we see someone like Serena Williams going to have her baby in probably what was, I would assume, was one of the best medical care facilities in the United States. But because doctors don't recognize that her body experiences pain in the same way, she was afraid that she would lose her life in the process. And we know that maternal mortality for Black mothers having their children in hospitals is disproportionately high. So I just wanted to point that out again. That empathy gap is more than just reading a book. It's unlearning, deforming years of and generations of formation. And that lies not with, again, it lies not with those that are the targets of violence, but it should be the responsibility of those that carry that incapacity to see empathy or feel it, as Imam al-Ghazali would say. Another thing that interdependence brings to this language and conversation, this mizan, this balance of creation that human beings are always at threat of turning on its head, is that intervention here in retributive justice systems is always and forever tied to a deeply capitalist, if not idolatry of capitalist views. So I think we have to begin to think, because the ownership of land has led to, as indigenous scholars would say, has led to so many other problematic interpretations. And here I don't mean just the owning of land, but the glorification of ownership, landowners, whether it's through a democratic, and I put that in quotes, democratic system. But we have to begin to, and I think Michelle Alexander actually, as I understand today, had a, I haven't read it, I've read people's bits of it on Twitter. Unfortunately, that's how I get my news in the morning. But this idea that interdependence is an interrogation of a capitalist system of organizing both religion, the state, and community. And when are we going to have a conversation around how our religious traditions have succumbed to a comfortability in being close to and in bed with a form of capitalism that is predatory, that is problematic, and in fact, as we now know in the United States, the private prison system in fact benefits, and companies benefit from the labor of private prisons. And our economy has always been based on that form of labor and continues to be. So how do we begin to have a conversation about the role of our religious traditions in their historical role of supporting this form of labor, and going forward, how do we liberate our practices? And that's why I think it's very important to have religious leaders speak to and be witnesses in these spaces.
1 minute.
All right, well, that's easy. So Amr Abdullah in his work talks about this notion of interdependence too, and says that any model that weds peacemaking to justice in the Muslim tradition should articulate sort of 3 different values. One of them is to restore Islam to its message of freedom and equality. And I think one of the most important pieces here, he has 3. The second is engaging the community in the intervention and resolution process. And the third is to adjust the intervention technique to the conflict stages. So it's really important here to think about what is the role of community. We can use the early versions of restorative justice, and now from there we've moved into Kaba's work and others to transformative justice. And to me, transformative justice finds, and healing justice, the work of Prentice Hemphill with Black Lives Matter and others have seen that it is not just getting justice by incarcerating people who are also doing violations, but the idea of the whole community. And an example of this is an imam that was in my class, Imam Jihad Zafir of Islah LA. He's my doctoral student and took a restorative justice course. And then utilized, and he has a graphic of all the prophets of the Muslim tradition, which we share with many with Christianity and Judaism, talking about how they did restorative justice in their own communities. And it's been powerful because at the full-time Islamic school that he runs in South LA, the kids meet once a month in community in a circle. And together, the children, 2nd to 4th grade, decide on what to do when there has been a conflict. So instead of engaging retribution, they're using a process. And it's moved beyond restorative to where the community, when they want to or have a conflict with one another, will call a healing circle. So now it's become a part of the culture. And what I think is powerful is that it becomes an alternative to policing, because not just an alternative to keeping, one of the reasons I was so involved with restorative justice programs in the last 20 years in high school was that it correlated with the rise of police officers in high schools, was to keep children being able to resolve their own conflicts so they were not incarcerated. But it also is now an alternative to policing, taking the responsibilities away from those that are in power and recognizing that communities, and this is where I think is so exciting about the future of, particularly for Muslim communities, how do we reframe safety? And for immigrant Muslim communities, unfortunately, so many times that has been calling in the police and a reliance on law enforcement who surveil our communities, but also, as we know, are inherently and systemically dealing with the realities of anti-Black violence. So I wanted to just give us a way forward that in fact it's actually in the tradition that we have this capacity for interdependent models of ecosystemic justice based on our scripture. And I had a whole section on Prophet Muhammad's examples and stories, but maybe another time, inshallah. Thank you for
Time. Perfect timing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saeed. As always, very insightful, very thought-provoking. I truly appreciate both you and Dr. Schoener being with us for this conference on tonight, being our keynote speakers. It is now time for our monitored Q&A. I do see that we have 2 questions here, but I just wanted to start with one. This question is for Dr. Schoener, and if I can read all of my scratch, but in terms of the role and agency of women in the ancient world, right? You insist that women were there, full stop, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. I also appreciated you mentioning the notion of a community of leadership, right? And not simply Jesus leading by himself. Yet the perception that women were confined to domestic spaces, not allowed to work for pay, and or had no religious leadership continues to dominate early Christian histories, as well as biblical interpretation, right? So how do we stop this perception from being so prevalent? I mean, it becomes quite difficult when we have to fight or retrain or teach folk to make space for these women and other folk who are disenfranchised by race, class, and gender. And also for people, many of our students and not, who find it hard or even blasphemous to even question what's in the text.
Right. Well, thank you for that question. Of course, it's a question in part of organizing among biblical scholars, right? We've been talking about organizing. Part of what our responsibility is to do is to use that language of women were there, full stop. And that's your language, by the way. I want to just give credit where credit is due, Dr. Smith. It was in my talk, but it comes from you, Dr. Smith. In any case, women were there full stop. And I think one of the ways that I often do this with my students that's pretty illuminating is to say, well, who was cleaning houses in the 1950s when women were only allowed to be at home, right? And pretty quickly, at least with my student population, all of a sudden they go, oh, and I always ask, well, are African-American and Latin American women, are they allowed to be women? Or are they, you know, how do we define womanhood is, of course, one of the real questions, right? And who gets to be a woman becomes a really important piece that we fight around in terms of ancient historiography. Who gets to be a woman in the biblical text, right? If we only go by the gendered nature of Greek, or we only go by the gendered nature of English, right? All of a sudden women just disappear. But we know that in just about any group that's gathered, there are always women present. And anyone who identifies as a woman gets to be a woman, full stop, right? I mean, even as there are absolutely layers and differences in definitions of how womanhood is construed and constructed socially, right? I'm guessing that, well, I will say that as a Lutheran woman in ministry, my notion of womanhood was crafted very differently than some of my friends who grew up even in Catholic parishes, right? Their notions of womanhood were created very differently because they had some other ways of thinking about who women were than I had. And it's different across race, it's different across religion, it's different across country and culture. And there's no sort of one way to be woman. All of who we are, I mean, this is Professor Said, right? All of who we are is made inherently dignity filled. And in that, all of who we are is partly woman too. But what I recognize in me as woman is not the same that is in you as woman, is in Professor Said as woman. You, Dr. Smith.
Right.
So.
And I agree with you. I agree with you about, you know, it's inherent, right? As well as what Dr. Said said about dignity. Everyone is born with dignity, right? And you also said it is not granted by others, but is endowed by God. But apparently other folk don't get that, you know, how it's so hard to, I think that's where most of the problems come from, is that especially in this racist, patriarchal society, I can go on with all of these interlocking systems of oppression, right? People feel as though it is their right to assign dignity or to assign you to embrace your full agency. As you said, you know, Dr. Said, you said the women of the Black Lives Matter movement, they had agency, right? We just need to acknowledge it, right? So how do we do that? How do we get folk to acknowledge it, to name it, to understand that, hey, we were born with dignity. It's not your position, or you don't have the power to assign it or to take it away.
I mean, I think we also have to talk about the role of secularities here, because I think religion does not exist without the domestication of the state. And so one of the capacities that are very difficult for us to talk around gender and violence is that for communities that are, and I'm speaking here particularly around the Muslim community in the United States, is a community under pressure of Islamophobia added to that existing forms of racism, xenophobia, depending on the community. It can be, it's understandable that there is a pressure to present the best version of that religious tradition. So sometimes the fear of being able to speak openly about violations of dignity in a community can be produced by external conditions. And so I say that because I think it's important for us to understand that models that individuals, women use within their communities will not always look the same. And there may be accommodations that are made because of the realities of the pressures that that community faces. So I just wanted to, that's one way in which secularities operate. The other is that in my work, I talk about Muslim women presenting a perspective on religious pluralism that is embodied. They're in interruptions. I talk about, for instance, myself, I'm an interruption when I walk into a state capitol building. I'm an interruption when I walk into a state university and teach. I'm not saying anything. I'm not, you know, and imagine for individuals who have layered on that other forms of identity that are already deemed threatening to the state, whether or not they actually are is an issue. But what I think is fascinating is, why aren't we asking people who are engaged with that regular negotiation how that embodied pluralism finds a theological basis, finds its own language? And so one of the ways we tell people is to speak from that experience. And that experience doesn't just teach us about religion, but it also teaches us about what it means to be religious in a state that I would say in its public theology right now, or its political theology, is really weaponizing one particular religion in a very problematic way. So I think it's just important to think to sort of think about how we learn from people's experience and lived religion, in addition to scriptural understanding, and in fact take some of that back to scripture and thicken our theological, or if we're jurists, whatever our discipline is, not to be afraid to understand and engage. The last thing I'm going to say here is I would encourage people to look at the work of femonationalism. There have been a couple of books that have come out in which, particularly in Europe, the studies of white feminists utilizing feminist sounding tropes against North African and other immigrants. And so we know in the United States, these are different dynamics, but the use of the protection of the white woman and white women calling the police. So I think we have to have a deep conversation about that.
Just so that our audience will know what to look for.
Femonationalism, I think it's Sarah Ferris's work. It's a book based more on Europe, but I would just encourage us to think about. And there are more books. There's another book out on the history of white women who were slave owners, because it has to be engaged, and we have to talk about the reality of sometimes the incapacity for solidarity when those histories are not acknowledged and are not at the table. And I think Dr. Schoener did a wonderful job of articulating that. I think I'll stop here. But that's part of the agency language, is not lending agency just to all feminist rhetoric, quote unquote, when it isn't interrogated for its impact or its lack of inclusion of historical violations. And it doesn't have to, and I mentioned one population, but in other countries, it could be a different population.
Right. Yeah, this is exactly the issue with how we understand women in antiquity, right? Because we only understand the wealthy elite women in antiquity. But one of the things that I think white women, many of us in white Protestant circles, we grow up, of course, to be loving and kind, and this is all the rhetoric that we're given. But what we don't see, what none of us see growing up as white women in the U.S. is, and I'm going to use an image from Toni Morrison, her Playing in the Dark, is that there's a whole fishbowl that holds our lives together, and that fishbowl is made up of people who we just don't see. We're never told to see, we're never trained to see. And once we start to see them, all of a sudden, life is never comfortable in that fishbowl again, ever, right? Because there's so much dissonance in your life around the ways that white women are trained to be in authority, are trained to sort of pander for particular kinds of attention, but then not always able to really see the full humanity and dignity in our sisters, right? So I think one of the things that is really important in terms, for me, Professor Said, you asked that question, what does peace look like to you? Peace looks like living a life that isn't entirely comfortable for me, because it can't be if the world is as big and as dignified as it's been created to be. So thank you for that. You actually, I loved that question. That's such an amazing question.
Thank you so much. I'm looking at the time. Dr. Grafton, do you want me to get one more from the audience, or how do you want me to proceed?
Yeah, do one more. Do one more.
Okay. I'm looking, there's one, says, thank you for this informative session. I want to ask a question for both speakers. In your opinion, why religions didn't empower women in slavery as the legacy of human rights law? I'm not sure how you want to interpret that, but that's, yeah. Can you see the question if you click on the Q&A at the bottom? It's the last one there. Unmute yourself. Dr. Said. Okay. The last one. In your opinion, why religions do not empower women in slavery as the legacy of human rights law? If whoever posed the question, if you have a clarification, that would help. If
Well,
not,
so I can take a crack at that if that's helpful.
please.
As a scripture scholar, as a Christian scripture scholar, let me be clear. As a Christian scripture scholar, I mean, some of it has to do with our history of canonization and how these texts actually come to us through the multiple layers of copying and recopying. And then, you know, the materials that these texts are written on, they disintegrate into the beautiful earth that is our legacy, right? And so we actually we have the texts that the winners have wanted us to have. And it's not, and the winners are the empire, right? I mean, by 4th century Constantine, we do have some notion of canon by then in the Christian canon, but it's still been fought over and fraught, and women in particular, it's been fought on the backs of women. I mean, it's another kind of war that women were problematic for. I mean, why isn't Mary Magdalene our chief apostle? Why wasn't she the first pope? I'm not trying to actually be disrespectful to Roman Catholic traditions, but what I am saying in particular is that the ways in which Christian traditions get empiricized, become imperial, and then only come down to us through that empire format means that we have to do a lot of work to reconstruct the liberative strands within it that were, in fact, I think, so powerful that the empire couldn't totally destroy them.
Right.
But the empire wasn't about to preserve them as the main thrust of the tradition, right?
That's why we pay attention to what's missing and who's not there.
Absolutely.
I think we have time for just one more, and I think this one is for you, Dr. Said. Said, one of them says, please talk more about the empathy gap. Like, what conditions need to be present to lessen or close the gap? Thinking that peace looks like closing that gap.
So I think there's an empathy gap that I mentioned around race and racism. And in addition to that, I think we're looking and learning a lot more about what's called perspective taking. And I would point you to the work of Moskowitz and Winner on this idea of perspective taking, where we build and we do actually, through human contact, deprovincialize, that's the word, deprovincialize our perspective of the world. And I think what's helpful as we think through about the work of that empathy gap is that every time a larger issue is spoken about, I think it's important to add to it the layers, and here I speak about the United States context, add to it the layers of experience and narratives for communities. So for instance, when we are thinking about right now this pandemic, COVID-19, very often the language that's utilized for communities that are affected don't speak to the particular experiences of various communities. So instead of, and I say this as you're developing panels for your institutions or your universities, there is a Black Muslim coalition that has been founded. I would encourage you to look on COVID-19. So it's not just looking, for instance, part of the empathy gap is to understand how a community experiences the news of the day. And I would really point out that one of the reasons we have these types of empathy gaps is that very often people are uncomfortable to hear stories that don't validate what they believe about the world. And unfortunately, the erasure, particularly of in the Muslim community of Black Muslims from that narrative, is one that has been integrated and indoctrinated with immigrant Muslims or those that are non-Black Muslims. So while in the United States, the majority of Muslims are non-white, it doesn't mean that you have to be, it doesn't mean that you could be under the category person of color, which we can interrogate also, and have a deeply embedded anti-Black racism still. So I wanted to point that out as well, that the work has to be done to understand that particularly when we elevate religion as one form of identity or one part of the sort of a three-legged stool of how we form identity, one has to engage race, one has to engage economics, and to hear those stories and to be able over time to understand, in particular, excavate in your own historical family, community, neighborhood, nation state, what has promoted the incapacity for empathy, because it's a work that has to be deeply contextual, deeply engaged in a model of inquiry, self-autobiography. It's not something I can do for you. It's something that you have to do. And I think it's important to read. There's also resources in the Muslim community, the Muslim Anti-Racism Coalition, Marguerite Hill's work. I often teach her writings in my classes. It's important to do reading. It's important to engage. And I think really at the core of it, one of the things that it takes is a sense of humility. You know, I often tell my students, if arrogance is not the foundation of active listening. And arrogance is not, one cannot be arrogant and be empathetic.
Right.
You know, so yeah, those are some of the tools I would encourage folks to consider. I named some organizations. And I think also, to get to Dr. Schoener's point, I would also just really encourage folks to really think through your niyyah. This is from the Muslim perspective, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّةِ, that every act is but its intention. So are you engaging in even doing social justice work for a purpose of looking good publicly? Are you doing it from the savior complex? Are you doing it to displace? So Adab al-Kabir on Twitter and other places, and I would encourage you to read her work as well, talked about this notion of passing the mic. You know, it's not just speaking for people, but it's also, you know, getting out of the way.
Right.
So, you know, this idea of the savior complex. I would also encourage you to look at Layla Abu Dawood's work particularly on saving Muslim women. A lot of people love to save us. I often tell people, just get out of my way. That would be super helpful. I don't need you to save me. I'm doing well. Kashmiri women have a very long tradition living under occupation. We just, you know, it's the saving component is heightened when the United States wants to impose military presence in our countries, which is another piece. So I think just thinking through where your imagery comes from of a community, whether you're actually listening to people from that community speak about their experiences, or are you reading people who write about that community?
Right. Thank you. And I even have to say that I have to, I'm going to do some more reading on closing the empathy gap, because for me, it makes me a little nervous, because for me, when I'm thinking about the gap of empathy closing, it's getting you closer to understanding. And I'm like, I don't want someone who doesn't look like me to say, I understand, right? And that might not be what it's about. So that's why I said I need to do more thinking and reading about that as well.
Yeah, and I think part of what I wanted to make sure that people understand is this is not about, and so I no longer do dialogues on race. Maybe 20 years ago, that would be a conversation. It's not about a shorthand. And that's actually the problem with so much diversity and inclusion work. Now, if you want to have a program on racism, that's different, right? So part of the empathy gap to me is not about like listening to experiences and suddenly you wake up. It's about understanding how you have been formed in racism and in racist systems. And the empathy gap is, I wanted to point that out because I think it has implications around the embodied form of racism and why people who supposedly are doing anti-racist work, if you're not acknowledging and understanding in particular the role that religion has also played, since we are in a theological context, if you're not going to call it white Christian nationalism,
that's right,
then you're not going to ever understand the pathology that has, you know, and that pathology, when I use that word, I want to be very careful that it's not something that we use to create this notion that you can get rid of it easily. It is a strategy over time that has been developed to create hierarchy and systems. As Audre Lorde, you know, would say, there's no hierarchy and oppression. This is a form of oppression that is systematically created. So I think your point is really well taken. The empathy gap, and I think this is the problem that I have with a lot of empathy literature out there, is it doesn't take into account that someone could intellectually understand. They could want to understand, but it's not about understanding the person's experience. It's about understanding your own experience has created a block to be able to recognize. It's not about empathy of experience. It's about recognizing the full humanity of someone experiencing pain. So it's a very narrow thing that I wanted to point out there. And it has implications for how protesters have been treated, are being treated, how the medical industry treats people. I mean, so I think that's a really good question, because I don't want people to leave. The empathy literature and the empathy gurus out there have a very different formation of that word. And that's not what I'm espousing. I'm talking about undoing and understanding how you've been formed to see the lack of humanity in someone else.
Thank you so much. We can go on all night. I know I want to, but
Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grafton.
Yeah, Dr. Schoener and Dr. Said, thank you so much for starting us off this conference with a really rich topics and responses. And certainly, Dr. Smith, thank you for your moderating and your comments. We could go on all night. So a final thought here. We do have a poll. Susan, can you start that poll? There's a poll at the bottom of your screen to help us know how you heard about this particular conference. And while you're doing that, let me just say, if you were intrigued, you enjoyed, you were challenged by this evening, I invite you back tomorrow, 7 o'clock, same channel, same location. We will have 2 more keynote speakers and conversation, and then we'll be joined back on Wednesday night at the same time for a panel discussion. So thank you, everyone. Let's give a applause to our speakers. Thank you so much. And so we have here the poll. It's going on. How did you hear about the conference? 46% through the Hartford Seminary e-newsletter, 37% Facebook, 18% referral by another organization. That is awesome. That lets us know that we're networked and connecting with other groups. So that's fantastic. So once again, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We're glad you were here, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow night when the conference continues. Thank you, everyone.